"Get lost, old man." The words tore through the ornate living room like a whip, slicing through the festive air with sharp precision. Malcolm remained seated in his leather armchair, long grey beard meticulously trimmed, hands resting lightly on his lap, eyes calm yet penetrating. His posture exuded unshakable dignity, a quiet authority that contrasted violently with the storm of arrogance before him. His son, a young man in his late 20s, chest heaving with prideful fury, had chosen the moment with meticulous cruelty. His bride, radiant in cream and gold, standing inches away, witnesses of his public display of dominance. The bride froze, clutching her bouquet tightly, as if it could somehow shield her from the escalating tension. Every corner of the room seemed to shrink under the weight of the insult. The polished marble floors reflected the harsh afternoon light, making the air shimmer and intensifying the oppressive atmosphere. It wasn't just what had been said, it was the timing, the audience, the deliberate cruelty of humiliation that stung like acid. "Did you hear me?" His son spat, stepping closer. "I said get lost. You're useless, old, and a burden. We don't need you here." His voice cracked with forced authority, the anger only thinly masking the desperation beneath. He believed that volume, bravado, and public dominance could overpower years of patience, wisdom, and subtle strategy. Malcolm's silence was like a wall. He did not flinch. He did not respond. There was no trembling in his hands, no flare of anger in his eyes, only a deep measured calm. Yet within that silence lay a terrifying weight, decades of experience, careful observation, and precise foresight. He was not powerless. He was merely calculating. Every muscle in his body was controlled, every expression deliberate. His long grey beard, catching the slanting sunlight, became a symbol of patience, wisdom, and quiet authority. The bride shifted nervously, unsure where to look, trying to reconcile the young man's rage with the serene composure of his father. Her fingers trembled around the bouquet, petals brushing against her palms like fragile reminders of fleeting innocence. She could feel the tension coiling in the room, like a living thing ready to snap. The young man's arrogance was tangible, but Malcolm's calm created a counterweight that seemed almost impossible to measure. For a long moment, it was a standstill, a silent standoff in which pride, experience, and impulsive emotion collided. The son's chest rose and fell rapidly, his hands clenched into fists. His jaw was tight. Every instinct told him to push harder, to dominate the man he had long resented, to assert control. Yet every subtle shift, every minor movement by Malcolm, suggested a power far beyond what the young man could comprehend. With deliberate precision, Malcolm reached for the small screen of his phone, lying on the armrest. His fingers moved lightly, almost imperceptibly. A message was sent, the content secret, the timing perfect, and the outcome inevitable. It was a quiet act, almost invisible, but its significance would soon eclipse the arrogance and noise in the room. The son's eyes narrowed, convinced of victory. He stepped closer, voice rising even higher. "I said get out. Do you even hear me? You're pathetic. You have no say here." The words were meant to humiliate, meant to assert dominance in front of the bride, in front of any potential witnesses, in front of the world. He did not realize he had merely triggered a storm that had been patiently brewing for decades. Malcolm's eyes remained calm, unwavering, focused. His silence, his posture, and his long grey beard communicated a subtle but absolute authority. No shouting, no threats, no argument could compete with the precision and inevitability of what he had set in motion. Every insult hurled, every gesture of disrespect, had now become part of a chain of consequences, carefully orchestrated with patience and foresight. The bride took a tentative step back. Glancing between father and son, her voice caught in her throat. She sensed the undercurrent of power, the quiet, unshakable presence of a man who had weathered life's storms, a man who could not be rattled by words or tantrums. She realized that something far larger than anger or pride was unfolding. It was a lesson in authority, timing, and inevitability. Time seemed to stretch. The second hand of a distant clock ticked loudly in the silence, each tick echoing the son's desperation and Malcolm's calm. The young man had expected submission, conflict, or panic. What he had not anticipated was absolute composure, a patience that would not be rushed, and a response that was inevitable yet unseen. 30 minutes would pass before the consequences arrived, reshaping the room, the relationships and the future. But in this moment, the tension alone told the story. Pride would be humbled, disrespect would meet silent justice, and the power of calm wisdom would overshadow the bluster of youthful arrogance. Malcolm remained seated, hands folded, eyes steady, beard catching light, a living monument to patience, foresight and silent authority. His son, unaware of the storm already in motion, continued his verbal onslaught, each word only tightening the invisible chains of impending poetic justice. The bride, sensing the shift in energy, took a hesitant step back, her expression oscillating between fear and awe. The room felt suspended, a cinematic still of arrogance colliding with enduring wisdom, disrespect encountering quiet authority. And somewhere in the pause between heartbeats, a lesson was being written, precise and irrevocable. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second stretching the silence into something almost unbearable. Malcolm remained in his chair, calm and composed, long grey beard catching the light from the large bay window, fingers lightly tapping against the polished wood of the armrest. Every movement was measured, deliberate, as if time itself moved to his rhythm. His son, still brimming with arrogance and fury, paced the room like a caged animal, each step echoing off the marble floor, amplifying the tension that had already settled over the space. The bride lingered near the doorway, frozen between fear and fascination. Her fingers gripped the edge of her dress, knuckles white as she watched the confrontation unfold. She sensed something intangible, something far beyond anger or family squabbles, a subtle, invisible power emanating from the man she barely knew, whose silence now carried more weight than her husband's shouting ever could. "I'm serious. You don't belong here. I won't have you anywhere near us," the son barked, his voice sharp, full of youthful arrogance and untempered pride. He gestured wildly, knocking a small vase on the side table. The flowers shivered but did not fall, as if mirroring the tension in the room. Delicate, precarious, yet holding under immense pressure, Malcolm's eyes remained calm, scanning the room with measured observation. He noted every detail, the son's trembling jaw, the slight quiver in his hands, the quick glances at the bride seeking validation for his fury. Each observation was stored, catalogued, and silently analyzed. His mind worked like a quiet machine, precise and unyielding. With a subtle movement, Malcolm lifted the phone on his armrest. His fingers tapped lightly, almost casually, sending the single deliberate message that had been prepared minutes before. It was concise, coded, and intentional, a trigger that would set the next 30 minutes into motion. It would not merely humble the son, it would create an irreversible ripple of consequence. The son, oblivious to the silent machinations, continued his tirade. "You're pathetic. I can't believe we're even wasting our time with you. I'm done." He strode toward the door, chest heaving, fists clenched, believing that the act of expulsion would assert his dominance. But dominance, Malcolm had learned over decades, was never about volume or fury. It was about foresight, patience, and precision. The bride's eyes darted anxiously between the two men. She felt a strange tension pressing against her chest, a growing awareness that the man she had admired for his calm demeanor was not merely old or passive. Malcolm's silence, his posture, the slow, deliberate movements of his hands and beard, everything signaled a depth of authority and control far beyond her initial understanding. Outside, the city continued its rhythm. Cars hummed on the streets, distant voices filtered in from the sidewalks, and yet inside this ornate room time seemed suspended. 30 minutes would pass, Malcolm had calculated, and in that time the world as his son knew it would shift. The arrogance that had driven his actions, the pride that had fueled his words, would meet its first tangible consequences. The son, still pacing, noticed the slight shift in atmosphere, a subtle tension, almost imperceptible but powerful. His bravado wavered for a fleeting second. He could not place it. Was it fear? Anticipation? He shook his head, trying to regain control, but the calm in Malcolm's eyes was unnerving. It was the calm of someone who already knew the outcome, who had prepared for every possible deviation, who was entirely untouchable. Malcolm rose slowly from his chair, long grey beard flowing over his chest, every movement deliberate, creating a visual impression of controlled strength. He did not shout, he did not gesture violently, He simply moved with purpose, signaling with his posture that the moment had reached its precipice. The bride, sensing the moment's gravity, took a tentative step back, her fingers tightening around her bouquet. Her heart raced, and she realized that the situation was no longer just a quarrel between husband and father. It was a calculated lesson, a subtle orchestration of consequence that she had never seen before. Suddenly, a soft chime sounded from Malcolm's phone. He glanced at it briefly, unreadable expression, then returned his gaze to the sun. Something imperceptible changed in the young man's demeanor. His confidence, previously unshakable, wavered. He glanced around, sensing a shift in the energy, an unseen hand tightening the reins of control around him. The seconds ticked toward 30. Malcolm's calmness remained absolute, his beard catching the shifting sunlight, symbolizing the patience and quiet authority that had guided his every move. The sun, still furious and now slightly unsettled, had no idea that the chain of events set into motion by a single silent action was already unfolding. The bride watched, captivated, understanding that the lesson was inevitable and irreversible. 30 minutes later, everything would change. The arrogance, pride, and disrespect would meet tangible consequences, and Malcolm, as always, would remain silent, dignified, and in complete control, the master of the storm he had quietly summoned. The air outside the living room was heavy with tension, but the world continued its ordinary rhythm. Distant car horns, the hum of air conditioning, and the muted chatter of neighbors filtered through the walls. Inside, the tension had thickened, almost tangible, pressing down on the young man like a physical weight. He continued to pace, fists clenched, voice wavering as he barked insults that now sounded hollow even to his own ears. Malcolm remained seated, long grey beard neatly flowing over his chest, eyes unwavering, every line of his posture calm, precise and deliberate. His fingers rested lightly on the armrest, as if even the slightest movement could set another consequence into motion. He did not speak. He did not flinch. Yet every detail of his environment, the way the light fell on the polished floor, the faint rustle of papers on the desk, the subtle hum of life outside, had been observed, calculated and accounted for. The bride, standing awkwardly near the doorway, felt her pulse quicken. She glanced at her husband, noticing for the first time a tremor beneath the surface of his confident facade. His chest rose rapidly with shallow breaths. The arrogance that had dominated the morning now faltered. She caught the way his eyes darted toward the front door, as though sensing something she could not yet perceive. "Dad, this isn't fair," the son shouted, his voice cracking with both rage and unease. "You can't just—" His words trailed off as a soft vibration sounded from his phone on the side table. The device had remained silent until now. He reached for it with trembling hands, curiosity and apprehension warring in his expression. Meanwhile, Malcolm's gaze remained fixed on him, calm and unyielding, as if he could see through the layers of his son's pride directly into the chaos soon to unfold. His long grey beard caught the shifting sunlight streaming through the window, a visual symbol of decades of patience, wisdom, and quiet authority. It was not anger that gave him power, it was the absolute stillness of control, the knowledge that every step had already been anticipated. The young man's phone screen displayed a single incoming alert. His hands shook as he tapped it open. The message was simple, cryptic, and precise, a tool of consequence that he could neither ignore nor undo. His eyes widened as he read, the confidence in his posture crumbling, replaced by panic and disbelief. The bride, noticing the shift, instinctively took a half-step back, her expression mirroring a mix of shock and apprehension. The son's arrogance, which had fueled the insult earlier, dissolved in an instant. His face turned pale, lips trembling as he realized the depth of the storm his disrespect had unleashed. He glanced around the room, helpless, searching for a lifeline but found none. Every attempt to assert control failed. Every gesture of bravado now met with invisible yet unyielding opposition. Malcolm finally rose from his seat, long grey beard flowing with his deliberate movement, each step a silent punctuation in the unfolding drama. He walked toward the window, standing tall and still, observing. His calmness contrasted sharply with the son's panic, highlighting the gulf between patient wisdom and reckless pride. The bride, sensing the intensity of the moment, backed toward the door, now fully aware that something irreversible had begun. Her eyes widened as she caught the subtle changes in her husband, the tight grip on his phone, the tremor in his jaw, the rapid blinking as if trying to process the impossible. Outside the living room, the first tangible ripple of consequence began to manifest. The son's pride, once untouchable, now faltered under pressure. A soft, urgent knock sounded at the door, barely audible over the hum of the city beyond. He froze, uncertainty overtaking the bravado that had dominated the morning. Malcolm's eyes remained steady, unwavering, his long grey beard catching the morning light, every strand a symbol of measured patience and unspoken authority. The young man's panic grew, his gestures frantic, his anger now replaced by the first inklings of fear and regret. The bride, sensing the full scope of the unfolding events, stepped back further, realizing that the man she had witnessed being insulted and dismissed was not merely passive, he was in control, orchestrating a perfect lesson in humility and consequence. The knock came again, firmer this time, and the young man's hands began to shake. He could feel the power of the moment closing in on him, like a tide he could not resist. Every insult, every belittling word spoken earlier had compounded into a tangible reality, a force that was now unstoppable. 30 minutes had not yet fully passed, yet the first ripple of consequence had already struck. His composure had crumbled, his pride shattered, and the bride, once merely a witness, now understood the magnitude of what had been set into motion. The young man was trapped in a reality he could neither control nor escape, and Malcolm's calm, deliberate presence reinforced the inevitability of the outcome. In that tense silence, the room seemed suspended, a cinematic tableau of arrogance meeting patience, of disrespect colliding with quiet authority, and of pride giving way to impending reckoning. Malcolm's gaze remained fixed, unwavering, as if the next 30 minutes were already written, and the son's world was about to unravel in ways he could never imagine. The room had grown heavy with anticipation, almost as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Malcolm stood near the window, long grey beard catching the shifting morning light, his posture impeccable, exuding a calm that contrasted sharply with the storm of emotion overtaking his son. The young man, mid-20s, had paced relentlessly for the past 30 minutes, his fists clenched, chest rising and falling with erratic breaths, eyes darting to every corner as if searching for a way out of the invisible trap that had been set. The bride stood near the door, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, shoulders tense. Her face betrayed the dawning realization. She had underestimated the father she had briefly dismissed in conversation, the man whose silence now carried far more power than any shouted word could ever wield. Her wedding gown, pristine cream with gold embroidery, shimmered under the sunlight. Yet the elegance could not mask her growing unease. The young man's phone buzzed again. His hands shook as he snatched it up, eyes widening as he read the message that had arrived. Each word cut deeper than the last, each instruction carrying consequences he could neither escape nor manipulate. His son-like arrogance, the same arrogance that had propelled him to insult, ridicule, and belittle his father earlier, began to crack. Sweat formed at his temples and he swallowed hard, realizing with a pang of dread that control was slipping through his fingers. Malcolm remained calm, every inch of him radiating quiet authority. His long grey beard swayed slightly as he shifted, a visual testament to patience and foresight. He did not raise his voice. He did not intervene directly. All that was necessary had already been set in motion. His one message, sent with perfect timing and precision, was enough to unleash consequences that words or anger could not achieve. The young man stumbled back from the window, his voice now tinged with panic. This isn't happening. It can't be happening. He glanced at the bride, hoping for some shared solidarity, but her wide eyes and pale face told him that she was no ally. She now understood the depth of her father-in-law's authority, the deliberate orchestration behind his calm demeanor, and the inevitability of the reckoning that was unfolding. Outside, subtle movements in the street caught the attention of the young man. A figure approached, quiet but deliberate, their steps measured. His heart raced, each beat pounding like a drum of warning. Malcolm's calmness, his composed posture, and his steady gaze were the only constants in the room, an unyielding reminder that the son's frantic attempts to assert dominance were futile. The bride's voice quivered. Maybe we underestimated him, she whispered almost to herself. Her words were a confession, a recognition that arrogance and pride can blind even the closest allies. She stepped back, hands trembling, aware that the father she had once considered frail or inconsequential was the true orchestrator of events. The son's panic grew as he realized the first visible effects of his father's action. Calls he had ignored were now urgent. Messages that seemed trivial at first were now demands, obligations and consequences converging at once. His sense of security, once unshakable, dissolved entirely. He clutched his head in frustration, unable to comprehend the scope of what had been triggered in such a short span. Malcolm's expression remained serene. His long grey beard, catching the morning light, symbolized the enduring power of patience and wisdom. Every subtle gesture, every slight movement communicated a silent message. The outcome is inevitable, arrogance is futile, and respect must be restored. No anger was needed. His calm alone was sufficient to command the situation. The young man's pride collapsed further when the bride, her own shock mingling with growing fear, turned away from him, moving toward the door with a quiet urgency. Her departure, though subtle, amplified the gravity of the moment, a tangible sign of the social and personal consequences of disrespecting someone like Malcolm. Time seemed suspended. Every second stretched as the realization sank in. The carefully measured, deliberate act by Malcolm had set into motion a chain of events that could no longer be undone. The room felt like a stage, and the young man had unwittingly written his own downfall into the scene. Malcolm finally spoke, his voice low, calm, and weighted with authority. Some lessons cannot be taught by words alone. He did not raise his hand, did not make a dramatic gesture. The calm in his presence, the commanding image of his long grey beard, was enough to underscore the inevitability of the lesson. The young man's body slumped, his confidence shattered. The bride's departure became imminent, a visual confirmation of the first wave of consequence. He realized too late that no shouting, no threats, no prideful display could reverse the inevitable. His arrogance, his disrespect, and his impulsive actions had triggered a chain that he could neither predict nor control. As Malcolm returned to his chair, still radiating composed authority, the tension in the room shifted. The storm had begun, and the first ripple of poetic justice was clearly visible. The bride, now halfway out the door, glanced back once at her husband, eyes wide with fear and astonishment. She saw the quiet power of a man who had been insulted, belittled and dismissed, yet who had orchestrated consequences so precisely that humiliation and reckoning were inevitable. The son, trembling and pale, finally realized that his father's calm and patience were far more potent than any shouted insult. Every arrogance-fueled action of the morning had compounded into a reality he could not escape. Malcolm's long grey beard, his serene posture, and his deliberate movements symbolized the authority and wisdom that no disrespect could ever diminish. 30 minutes had nearly passed, and the room seemed to pulse with the inevitability of what was to come. The son's desperation, the bride's realization, and Malcolm's silent orchestration converged into a cinematic tableau of pride meeting patience, arrogance colliding with wisdom, and disrespect meeting poetic justice. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, its light spilling through the windows and illuminating the tense scene with a harsh clarity. Malcolm sat in his armchair, long grey beard flowing over his chest, fingers resting lightly on the armrest, eyes calm and piercing. Every line of his face was composed, every breath measured. The silence around him was deafening, filled with the weight of anticipation. Outside the living room, the world continued unaware, but inside, the storm Malcolm had quietly orchestrated was about to reach its peak. His son staggered in the center of the room, pale sweating, chest rising and falling rapidly. The pride that had carried him through insults and arrogance only moments ago had collapsed entirely. His trembling hands fumbled with his phone, attempting to regain control, only to find each call, message and alert a reminder of the consequences he had set into motion himself. The arrogance that had once seemed untouchable now lay shattered like glass on the floor. The bride, standing by the doorway, clutched her bouquet, eyes wide with disbelief. Her own pride had been challenged indirectly, her trust shaken, and she could feel the shift in her husband's authority crumbling before her eyes. She realized in a heartbeat that Malcolm's patience and deliberate actions had toppled more than just words. They had dismantled an entire facade of dominance that his son had taken for granted. "Dad, please, I didn't mean—" His voice faltered, choked with desperation. The words sounded hollow, insignificant even to himself. Every plea was a testament to his realization that power cannot be reclaimed through anger alone. His attempts to assert authority, once loud and defiant, now felt meaningless in the face of the invisible storm Malcolm had summoned. Malcolm finally rose, long grey beard swaying with his deliberate movements, eyes fixed on his son. He did not shout. He did not raise a hand. The sheer presence of his calm, measured authority was enough to dominate the room. "Some lessons," he said softly, "cannot be ignored." Each word, though quiet, resonated with absolute finality. The young man collapsed into the nearest chair, head in hands, utterly defeated. His pride, the arrogance that had driven him to insult his father in front of his bride, was now a distant memory. His chest heaved with guilt, shame, and an unfamiliar fear. Malcolm's patience had transformed into power, and it was far more effective than anger ever could have been. The bride, witnessing the scene, took a cautious step forward. She had expected arguments, perhaps tension, but nothing had prepared her for the deliberate, cinematic unraveling of the man she had married. She now understood that her husband's disrespect had not gone unnoticed, and that the consequences were both immediate and merciless. A soft knock at the door interrupted the tension. The son's eyes widened in alarm, his previous confidence evaporating. Outside, the consequences had arrived. Figures of authority, professional and poised, waiting to enforce what had been silently set into motion. He had underestimated the reach and foresight of his father, the deliberate orchestration behind every subtle gesture. Malcolm did not move toward the door. His calm presence was enough to convey control. The young man rose slowly, hands shaking, understanding fully that he was powerless against the carefully executed consequences of his actions. His wife's eyes mirrored the realization of irreversible change. Pride, arrogance, and disregard could not withstand patience combined with precision. The officers entered quietly, professional and imposing, their presence magnifying the son's humiliation. Each step they took was measured, deliberate, and without malice, yet it carried the force of authority. The young man trembled, his previous arrogance replaced entirely by desperation. He could not shout, could not protest, could not hide. Everything he had taken for granted in life, his control, his pride, his sense of superiority, now evaporated in 30 minutes of calculated consequence. The bride stepped back, covering her mouth in shock. The humiliation was complete. The son, once loud and proud, now knelt in shame, head bowed, hands trembling as he faced the weight of what he had done. Malcolm's calm, measured demeanor, long grey beard flowing, eyes unwavering, had turned what could have been a private insult into a public reckoning. No further words were necessary. Silence carried the weight of poetic justice. The bride left the room, realizing the young man's arrogance had cost her trust, and the son, utterly broken, could only beg for forgiveness, his voice barely audible. Malcolm returned to his chair, hands folded, posture regal, embodying the quiet authority that had dictated every action, every consequence, every irreversible moment. The lesson was clear, unshakable. Pride and disrespect, when met with patience, foresight, and silent authority, lead inevitably to humility, desperation, and accountability. The cinematic tableau was complete. Arrogance crushed, consequences delivered, dignity preserved, and justice executed without a single act of rage. The sun had moved higher, its golden light spilling across the living room, glinting off the polished marble floor, and illuminating the aftermath of the storm that had quietly but deliberately unfolded. Malcolm remained seated in his armchair, long grey beard flowing over his chest, hands folded calmly, eyes steady, an unshakable monument of dignity and quiet authority. The room, once filled with insults, arrogance, and tension, now held only the weight of consequences, silence, and reflection. His son sat on the edge of the couch, shoulders slumped, face pale, eyes wide with the understanding of complete defeat. The arrogance that had propelled him to shout, kick, and humiliate his father had dissolved entirely under the pressure of precise, calculated retribution. Every message Malcolm had sent, every small, deliberate gesture, had orchestrated a reality his son could not escape. His pride was shattered, his confidence evaporated, and for the first time in his life, he truly understood the power of patience, foresight, and silent authority. The bride, who had initially stood frozen in the doorway, now fled the house entirely, her steps hurried and hesitant. She did not look back, leaving the young man alone with the weight of humiliation. Her departure symbolized not just a personal loss but the tangible consequences of disrespect, a public acknowledgement that pride and arrogance could dismantle relationships. Faster than words could explain, Malcolm finally spoke, his voice calm, low, and measured. Respect is earned, not assumed, and arrogance is fragile. Each word landed like a hammer, yet delivered with the gentleness of inevitability. He did not shout. He did not raise a finger. His authority was absolute in the quiet, in the deliberate pause, in the composed presence of a man who had mastered patience and precision over 70 years of life. The young man, trembling, reached out in vain, his voice cracking. "Dad, please, help me. His words faltered, each syllable betraying fear, shame, and regret. But the lesson had already been delivered. Malcolm remained still, a silent observer, long grey beard catching the light, eyes unwavering, a living embodiment of dignity and unspoken power. Outside, the subtle arrival of law enforcement or professional authority had completed the chain of consequence that had been quietly initiated 30 minutes after the insult. The young man realized too late that what had seemed like a simple message or a calm response was, in fact, a carefully constructed orchestration of justice. Each action had been deliberate, every timing perfect, leaving him powerless, alone, and humbled. The bride, now fully out of sight, had left him with a visual and emotional void, a sharp reminder of how quickly relationships could crumble under arrogance and disrespect. He was left to face his father's calm, commanding presence, a reminder that words and bluster alone could never overpower foresight and patience. Malcolm's long grey beard, a silent signature of decades of experience, flowed over his chest as he shifted slightly, remaining seated, yet radiating dominance and authority. He did not celebrate the downfall of his son. There was no joy in humiliation. Instead, there was the quiet, undeniable satisfaction of poetic justice, a balance restored, a lesson delivered and dignity preserved. The son, now kneeling, head bowed, finally understood the depth of his actions. He whispered apologies, broken and desperate, but Malcolm's silence was the final verdict. Words were unnecessary. The consequences had spoken louder than any plea could. The lesson was engraved into his soul. Disrespect yields only loss, arrogance invites collapse, and underestimating wisdom leads to inevitable reckoning. Time passed slowly. The room settled into a calm stillness, punctuated only by the soft hum of the city beyond the windows. Malcolm remained serene and composed, his long grey beard a testament to endurance and quiet authority, as the young man grappled with the full weight of humiliation, regret, and the irreversible consequences of his actions. Finally, Malcolm rose slightly, looking down at his son with eyes that conveyed both authority and unshakable patience. "Some lessons," he said softly, "cannot be unlearned. Remember this." He returned to his chair. Posture perfect, every movement deliberate, every gesture a study in restraint and power. The son remained kneeling, a broken figure, stripped of pride, fully aware that his world had been irrevocably altered in less than an hour. Outside, the echoes of the bride's departure, the subtle presence of authority, and the weight of his father's calm served as relentless reminders of the power of patience and calculated action. In that silent room, the cinematic tableau was complete, arrogance crushed, pride humbled, dignity preserved, and justice delivered without a single act of rage. Malcolm's calm authority, reinforced by decades of wisdom and his long grey beard, had proven absolute. His son would never forget the lesson. The bride would never trust such arrogance again. And the quiet, patient power of a man insulted yet unshaken had delivered poetic justice with precision, inevitability, and cinematic finality. The final image lingered in the mind, a father seated in silence, long grey beard flowing, eyes steady and unwavering, the son broken, humbled, and alone, with the city beyond unaware of the storm that had passed. But the lesson forever engraved in the lives it touched